You're watching a man sit in a Zurich television studio with his face turned away from the camera. It is 1994. The program is called Rundschau. The man is a former engineer at a Swiss company that builds code machines, and the producers have hidden his identity so his words are read out by somebody else's voice while he sits in shadow at the edge of the frame. What he says is this: the machines his company sells to governments are built to be read, not by accident, by design, on purpose, from the drawing board, and the customers are foreign ministries and armies and embassies in more than 100 countries who pay a premium precisely because the box is Swiss. He is telling the truth, every part of it, and it will not matter at all, because the company will send its chief executive onto the same television station to deny it, calmly, in the register of a man who is tired of amateurs, and the denial will be good. Roughly 9 out of 10 of those customer countries will renew their contracts. The machines will keep shipping for another 24 years. The company was called Crypto AG. It sat in Steinhausen, in the canton of Zug, behind a glass door with a small brass plate, about 230 people on the payroll. Its customers included Iran, Egypt, Libya, Argentina, Chile, India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Italy, Ireland, and the Vatican. Roughly 120 governments in all. It was owned by the Central Intelligence Agency and the West German Bundesnachrichtendienst. Not influenced, not infiltrated. Owned outright, 50-50, since June of 1970, through a chain of shell companies in Liechtenstein. The two services wrote the mathematics inside the machines. They collected the profits at the end of every year and split them. The CIA's own internal history of the operation, written around 2004, gives it a verdict in 8 words. It was the intelligence coup of the century. To understand how a Swiss company selling secrecy ended up belonging to 2 foreign spy agencies, you have to go back 50 years before that television studio to a Swedish engineer, a suitcase, and a friendship between 2 men who both understood that the safest place to hide is inside the thing everybody trusts. Start with the object itself, because the object is the whole story. A Hagelin cipher machine is a gray metal box roughly the size of a hardback dictionary. You set a row of wheels. You type a letter. The machine spits out a different letter. At the far end, another box with the same wheel settings turns the nonsense back into words. It is not a computer. In the 50s and 60s, it is a hand-cranked mechanism of pins and lugs, and later it becomes an electronic desktop unit with a keyboard, and later still a rack in a signals room, and the shape keeps changing, but the promise never does. The promise is that the message between your embassy and your capital is a sealed envelope. Governments do not buy that promise casually. They buy it from Switzerland. That was the entire sales pitch, and it worked for half a century. Switzerland had no colonies, no bloc, no dog in the fight. A Swiss box was supposed to be like a Swiss bank, indifferent to your politics and interested only in your money. Foreign ministries in Cairo and Tehran and Buenos Aires bought crypto machines for the same reason they held accounts in Zurich, and they were wrong about both for the same reason. Here is what the CIA history says about the arrangement, in a sentence that took nearly 50 years to reach the public. Foreign governments, it notes, were paying good money to the US and West Germany for the privilege of having their most secret communications read by at least 2 and possibly as many as 5 or 6 foreign countries. They paid for the surveillance. They filled out the purchase order themselves. But it did not begin with a purchase in 1970. It began with a dinner and a handshake and a man who refused to put anything in writing. Boris Hagelin was born in 1892 in the Caucasus to Swedish parents in a Russian empire that would not survive his childhood. He came into the cipher business the way people came into most businesses in 1920, because his father had put money into one. The company was AB Cryptograph in Stockholm, founded by an eccentric Swede named Arvid Gerhard Dahm, who was better at inventing than at selling. Boris took it over, renamed it, and did the thing Dahm could not. He made the machines small, cheap, and rugged, and then he sold them to armies. The French army bought his C-36 in the 1930s in quantity. Then in 1940, the Germans came into Denmark and Norway, and Sweden began to look like a very thin wall. Hagelin left. He got himself to the United States, and by the accounts of the trip he carried 2 of his machines with him in pieces, packed in his luggage like a disassembled clock. In Washington, he showed the American Army what he had. The Army took his C-38, renamed it the M209, and put it into production with a typewriter manufacturer in New York State called Smith Corona. They built about 140,000 of them. Every American battalion in the war got one. Hagelin got a royalty on each. He came out of the Second World War as, by common description, the first millionaire cryptography ever produced. And in 1948, he moved his business to Switzerland, better neutrality, better taxes, and in 1952 he incorporated it in Steinhausen as Crypto AG. The M209 made him rich. It also put his name permanently in a file in Washington. And the man who read that file already knew him. William Friedman was the father of American code-breaking, and that is not a nickname somebody gave him later. He built the discipline in the United States more or less from nothing. He was born in Kishinev, in the Russian Empire, the same vanished world Hagelin came from. The two of them had known each other since the 1930s, and they liked each other in the way that two specialists with almost no peers on Earth tend to like each other. They wrote letters for decades, business and personal in the same paragraph. In November 1947, Hagelin complained to Friedman that the American government was dumping its surplus M209s onto the market and undercutting him. "If this goes on," he wrote, "our own business here will be ruined." Friedman filed that away. Friedman filed everything away, because by then the American cryptologic establishment had a problem with its friend, and the problem was that he was very good. Hagelin's new designs were getting harder to break. An internal memorandum in May 1951 put it with beautiful bureaucratic candor. It would be to the advantage of the U.S. government if the proposed new or improved Hage machines were prevented from being developed. They did not want to break his machines. They wanted to decide who got them. So in 1951, Friedman took his old friend to dinner at the Cosmos Club in Washington and made him an offer. Restrict the strongest machines to a list of countries the United States approves. Sell the weaker versions to everybody else. And what did Hagelin get for shrinking his own market? Money. $700,000 was the figure discussed. The American board that governed these things refused to authorize the deal in December 1953. It took them another year to produce a version they could sign off on. And then, in February 1955, Friedman got on a plane. He arrived in Zug on the 21st of February 1955 and stayed a week. For 7 days, these two elderly friends walked around a Swiss town discussing the architecture of global secrecy, and on the evening of the 25th, Hagelin said yes. He accepted, in Friedman's own report of it, without reservations. There was one condition. Friedman wrote it down afterward with something close to admiration. He didn't want anything with respect to this deal on paper. No contract, no signature. A handshake between two men in their 60s. What Hagelin agreed to was this. He would not sell his best machines to countries on the American list. He would keep the National Security Agency informed of who his customers were, what they bought, and what he was developing next. And the NSA would write the sales brochures and the operating manuals for his flagship machine, the CX-52. Read that last part again slowly. The company selling secrecy to the world was now shipping its products with an instruction booklet written by the code breakers the products were supposed to keep out. Not the algorithm, not yet. The manual. The part that tells a clerk in an embassy in Damascus how often to change the key settings and how long a message may safely be. If you write the manual, you decide how the customer uses the lock. And a lock used the way its enemy told you to use it is not really a lock. Nobody had rigged anything yet. That was still to come, and it would take a different generation of men to do it. By 1957, the arrangement had a filing system, and the filing system is the ugliest document in this entire story. Hagelin sorted his own products into 3 grades. Best security, the CX52A, with the option of one-time tape, mathematically unbreakable if used correctly. That went to NATO members and Western states. Medium security, the standard CX52, good but not that good, for what the paperwork called friendly neutrals. Finland, Switzerland, Pakistan were the suggested names. And then low security, a stripped CX52C with the one-time tape option removed. That third list is the one that matters: the Middle East, Asia, the Soviet Union and its satellites, Indonesia, India, Egypt, all of them buying from the same catalog at similar prices from the same polite salesman out of Zug, and none of them knowing there were grades at all. There is a detail here that is almost too neat. The instruction booklets for the different grades carried small secret marks so that the sellers could tell at a glance which version a customer had. So the machines were already sorted, the customers were already ranked, and the men running this were about to decide that renting influence over the company was no longer good enough. In the late 50s, the CIA took the file over from the NSA and put the relationship on a proper commercial footing. There was a licensing agreement renewed in 1960 for a reported $855,000, with something like $70,000 a year on top, plus marketing expenses. Hagelin was now, functionally, a contractor. He was also getting old, and everyone involved could do the arithmetic on that. The CIA had already secured the right of first refusal when he retired. What changed the picture was that the Germans wanted in. In early 1969, at the West German Embassy in Washington, the head of West Germany's cipher service, a man named Wilhelm Going, laid out a proposal. The Germans intended to buy Crypto AG. They had thought about using Siemens as a front. And then Going asked the question the Americans had been waiting 15 years to be asked. Were they interested in becoming partners too? The Germans brought money and industrial cover. The Americans brought something the Germans did not have, which was the capacity to actually break the traffic at scale. There was one snag, and the Germans raised it themselves. Half the countries on the target list were NATO allies: Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Turkey. The BND was uneasy about reading friends. The reported American answer was that in this business there is no such thing. In June 1970, they bought the company for $5,750,000. 50-50. Ownership was buried under a Liechtenstein structure, anonymous foundations holding bearer shares, administered by a law firm in Vaduz called Marxer and Goop, stacked like nesting boxes, each one empty except for the next one down. It is the same machinery used to hide the money of people who do not want to be found. On the German side, the contract was signed by Horst Emke, the head of the Federal Chancellery. Siemens took over supplying crypto's management and kept 5% of the profits for about 20 years. The CIA gave the company a cryptonym, Minerva. The program was called Thesaurus, and in the 1980s they renamed it Rubicon. Boris Hagelin retired that year, 78 years old, rich, and out. His son had not wanted the sale. Bo Hagelin Jr. ran sales for the Americas, and he objected to what his father was doing. In 1970, he died in a car crash near Washington. The CIA's own history records it as an accident. It is reported that his father did not believe that. No evidence of anything else has ever been produced, and it is worth being clear about that. This is a suspicion, not a finding. On the Monday after the sale, roughly 400 people came to work in Steinhausen as usual. Two of them knew who owned the building. Now the mechanism, and I am going to explain it once because once is all it takes. Every one of these machines works on the same principle. It generates a long stream of characters that is supposed to be random, a key stream, and it combines that stream with your message. Add the stream, and words become noise. Add the identical stream at the other end, and noise becomes words again. Everything depends on one thing. The stream has to be unpredictable. If an outsider can predict the stream, the encryption is not weak. It is decorative. And the owners of the company wrote the streams. The National Security Agency and its German counterpart, an office called the ZFCH, designed the generators inside the machines. What they built were generators whose output looks random to anyone testing it from outside, and is not. It comes out of the machine like static on a dead channel. Buried in it was structure, a bias, a shortcut, a relationship between the wheel setting and the letters that came out. Nobody would find it by staring at the noise. It sat there like a watermark, invisible until you know to tilt the page. And it turned the search for the key from a task requiring centuries into a task requiring an afternoon. In practice, the agencies could read a diplomatic telegram about as fast as the ambassador it was addressed to. The partners even wrote down their design rules, and the CIA history quotes them. A rigged algorithm had to be undetectable by usual statistical tests. And if somebody did detect it, the flaw had to be easily masked as implementation or human errors. That is the whole trick. Not a hidden radio transmitter, not a bug in the case. The machines did exactly what the brochure said. They were sold as a safe with a 10-digit combination, and the combination was 10 digits, and every one of them was known in Maryland. Think of a lock whose key is stamped on the inside of its own faceplate. And the beautiful part, from Langley's point of view, was that a suspicious customer could take the machine apart, hand it to a university mathematician, and find nothing. There was nothing to find. The weakness was not in the box. It was in the arithmetic the box performed. Which is why the only real threat to this operation, for 48 years, was never a foreign government. It was the staff. Because Crypto AG had to employ actual engineers, and actual engineers keep poking at things. Mengia Kaflish was hired at the end of the 70s. She was an electrical engineer who had come out of radio astronomy at the University of Maryland. She was extremely good, and within a short time of arriving, she started running her own tests on the company's designs. She found weaknesses. She reported them. She went on finding them. The NSA's assessment of her, in the phrasing that has survived, was that she was too bright to remain unwitting. And yet she was kept unwitting, for years, working in a building whose owner she did not know. Jörg Spörndli was a software engineer, and his job included the opposite of engineering. He was told to take working algorithms and put weaker ones in. He did it. Years later, he described what that felt like in one flat sentence. You think you do good work and you make something secure, and then you realize that you cheated these clients. One of the devices he touched was the T450, a teleprinter encryptor. As shipped, it could be broken by an attacker who knew as little as 100 characters of the message in advance. 100 characters is a letterhead. It is a date and an address and the word confidential. Then there was Peter Frutiger, and Frutiger is where it nearly went wrong 20 years early. Frutiger kept being sent to Damascus because Syria kept complaining that its machines were behaving oddly. He was a good service engineer, so he fixed them. Nobody in Steinhausen had authorized him to fix anything, and one day in 1977, the message traffic coming out of the Syrian Foreign Ministry went dark, like a light switched off at the wall. The NSA noticed within days and complained to the company. Crypto's chief executive at the time was Heinz Wagner, one of the handful of people who knew exactly who he worked for. He fired Frutiger on the spot. Frutiger had already begun to suspect the company was working with German intelligence. He was now suspicious, and unemployed, which is the worst possible combination, and the partners had bought themselves perhaps 5 years. There was also a machine called the HC740 that went out with genuinely strong encryption in it, about 50 units, before the Americans caught it and had the design pulled. Customers were then told the good version had been discontinued. Firing engineers was a way of putting out fires. What the operation needed was somebody who could stop them starting. They found him in 1979, and he was the most valuable recruitment in the entire history of the program. Kjell Ove Widman was a Swedish mathematician and cryptologist, a respected academic, the kind of man who gets invited to give lectures. Swedish intelligence had been quietly cultivating him. In 1979, he was brought to Munich for what he was told were interviews with executives from Crypto and Siemens. They were not. They were a recruitment. He had one attribute the CIA valued above his mathematics, which was that he liked America. He had spent a year in Washington State as an exchange student, and it had stuck. Widman's job had 2 halves, and both of them were unusual. The first was to design algorithms good enough to survive inspection by a professional and weak enough to be read in Maryland, the hardest kind of engineering there is, because you are building something that must fail invisibly, on command, to exactly one audience. The second half was public relations of a very specific sort. When a customer got suspicious, Widman flew out. He was perfect for it. He was not a spy. He was a professor with publications, and he would sit down across a table from a colonel and explain the mathematics, and the colonel would come away reassured by a man who genuinely was one of the leading cryptologists in Europe. He worked as cover the way a white coat works as cover. Nobody checks the credentials of someone that convincing. In a few years, he would be sitting across a table from Argentine officers who had just fought and lost a war while their radio traffic leaked, telling them their machines were unbreakable. They believed him. Everything up to this point was the setup. Now the harvest. And the harvest is where the numbers stop being abstract. The single biggest prize was Iran. Iran was one of Crypto AG's most important customers, before the revolution and after it. And in November 1979, a crowd took over the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 people for 444 days. What the United States needed for the next 14 months was to know what the Iranian leadership actually intended, as opposed to what it announced. They had it. They were reading Iran's diplomatic cables. They were also reading Algeria's, and Algeria was the mediator, the neutral party carrying messages between Washington and Tehran, and Algeria bought its code machines from the same Swiss company. The United States could read both sides of the channel it was negotiating through. Bobby Ray Inman ran the NSA at the time. Asked about the operation decades later, he described it as a very valuable source of communications on significantly large parts of the world important to American policymakers, and on his own conscience, he said 4 words. Do I have any qualms? 0. On President Carter's questions during the crisis, he was more specific. We were able to respond to his questions about 85% of the time. And the scale of it kept growing. According to the CIA's internal history, in the year 1988 alone, the agencies decrypted something on the order of 19,000 Iranian messages, between 80 and 90% of everything Iran sent. Take away the Swiss machines, and that number would have collapsed to almost nothing. Which raises the obvious question about the other customers. And the other customers included people the United States was sitting in a room with. In September 1978, President Sadat of Egypt spent 13 days at Camp David negotiating with Israel, with the United States as broker. The American side was reading Sadat's communications with Cairo throughout. Be precise about what that means because it matters. Israel was never a Crypto AG customer. This was not both sides. It was one side, the Egyptian side, laid open to the mediator who was reading the private instructions and doubts and fallback positions of the man across the table while presenting himself as an honest broker. Nobody has published the specific decrypts. What is documented is the capability and the fact that it was used. Then there is the part of the story with bodies in it. Between 1975 and 1983, the military governments of Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil ran a joint campaign against their own citizens and each other's exiles. It was called Operation Condor. People were abducted in one country and delivered to torturers in another. Thousands were disappeared, a verb those countries had to invent. Condor needed secure communications, and it built them. The network was called Condortel, and it worked like a party line strung between 6 police states. It ran first on CX-52s. In 1977, the group upgraded to electronic models. A Defense Intelligence Agency report records that Argentina supplied Hagelin H-4605 equipment to Condortel, and a CIA report from May 1977 notes that Brazil agreed to provide gear for the network. Every one of those machines came from a company owned by the CIA. So the position is this. The men coordinating a continental campaign of abduction and murder were doing it over radios supplied and mathematically controlled by American intelligence. Reporting on the leaked documents shows that CIA officials were aware of the junta's abuses and, in places, alarmed by them. It shows no substantial effort by American officials to stop the violence. And here is where I have to stop and mark the edge of what is known, because this is the point where this story gets exaggerated online, and it does not need exaggerating. The decrypts are still classified. We know the capability existed, and that Condortel ran on compromised gear. We do not have a document showing that Washington read a message naming a particular person on a particular night and let it happen. That evidence has not been published. What the historian Peter Kornblue and others argue is narrower and harder to dismiss. That in Latin America, American knowledge of that machinery was read as a form of participation in it. The junta's radios were rigged. So were the radios of the country the junta went to war with 4 years later. And that war involved an ally. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, and Britain sent a fleet 8,000 miles to take them back. The United States passed Britain intelligence drawn from Argentine military communications. Britain's own signals agency had been briefed on the operation as part of the arrangement between the two countries. Now the honest qualification. Nobody has established how much of Britain's advantage in that war came from crypto machines specifically, as opposed to the other ways a Navy and an Air Force leak. Argentina used several systems. Argentina was also, by then, already suspicious of its Swiss equipment, which is exactly why Widman was flown down to explain, in the calm voice of a European professor, that everything was fine. 4 years later, the operation was nearly destroyed by the President of the United States. On the 5th of April, 1986, a bomb went off in the La Belle discotheque in West Berlin. 3 people were killed, 2 of them American servicemen. 229 were injured. American intelligence had the traffic between Tripoli and the Libyan embassy in East Berlin, including messages about the attack. 10 days later, Reagan ordered the bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi, and to justify it, he went public with the fact that the United States had read Libya's messages. He was telling the truth. He was also, in the same breath, telling 120 governments that their code machines leaked. Whether the specific Libyan messages he referred to came from crypto equipment or from some other collection has been argued over ever since, and the public record does not settle it. What is not in dispute is the reaction inside the program. This was the first genuine scare in 16 years, and the men running Minerva sat and waited for the phones to start ringing in Steinhausen. Almost nobody rang. The orders kept coming. That is the fact in this story that is hardest to sit with. Not the rigging, the indifference. The operation had survived a president's mouth. It did not survive a salesman with a suitcase. Hans Bühler joined Crypto AG in 1979 as a sales engineer, and for 13 years he sold code machines around the world. He was born in Uster in 1941. He was an amateur radio operator. His call sign was HB9XJ. He was, by every account, exactly what he appeared to be, a competent Swiss salesman who believed in his product, which was easy because his product was the best-regarded product in its field. He did not know. That is the thing to hold on to for the next few minutes. Bühler did not know. In August 1991, an exiled former Prime Minister of Iran named Shapur Bakhtiar was stabbed to death in a house in Suresnes, outside Paris. On the 7th of August, one day before the body was found, Iranian intelligence sent a coded message to its embassies asking whether Bakhtiar was dead. Western services read it. Later, the United States handed France the contents of decrypted Iranian messages, which helped convict 2 men for the murder. Iran did the arithmetic. Somebody was reading their traffic, and their traffic went through Swiss machines. In late March 1992, they arrested the salesman. Bühler was taken in Tehran on charges that included spying, bribery, illegal contacts, and drinking alcohol. He was interrogated 3 times a day. He was held for 292 days. His interrogators wanted one thing. They wanted him to explain how the back door worked. And he could not, because he had no idea there was one. 9 months of questions came down on him like rain on a roof, with nothing underneath it. He was being broken for the answer to a question he had never thought to ask, about a company he had given 13 years of his life to, and everything he told them in good faith was worthless because it was true. The CIA's own history calls this episode the most serious security breach in the history of the program. And here is where, if this were a film, the whole thing would come apart. This is the scene it would build to. A Swiss citizen in an Iranian cell because his employer is a front. The Iranians have the suspicion, the press have the arrest, the company has a hostage it cannot explain, and both agencies have their fingerprints on the bail. If this were a film, the next act is the exposure, the parliamentary committee, the resignations, the front pages, the customers canceling. None of that happened. Bail was set on the 8th of September 1992 at $1 million. Crypto AG at first refused to pay it. Then the money appeared, and where it came from tells you everything about who really owned the company. The German BND paid the entire sum, routed through a federal asset management office to keep it clean, because the White House had refused to let the CIA put up its half. A West German government agency quietly ransomed a Swiss salesman out of Iran to protect an American espionage operation. And on the 5th of January 1993, Hans Bühler walked out of prison and flew home. He thought the worst thing that would ever happen to him was behind him. It took 10 weeks to prove him wrong. On the 10th of March 1993, Crypto AG fired him. Both intelligence services objected. A freshly sacked, freshly traumatized insider is precisely the person you do not want walking around loose. And the company did it anyway, because Bühler had come home asking questions. Then the company sent him a request to repay the $1 million that had bought him out of Evin prison. It later dropped that request. On the 19th of July 1994, it obtained a restraining order to stop him making public allegations. In the autumn of 1995, the whole thing was settled out of court for 250,000 Swiss francs and a closed mouth. He talked anyway. He said his employer had built back doors into its equipment for German and American intelligence. He was right. He had worked it out from the outside, from 9 months of Iranian questions and one abrupt dismissal, and he could not prove a word of it. Which brings us back to that television studio. In March 1994, the Zurich journalist Res Strela published a book about the case. That spring, Swiss television broadcast it, Bühler on camera, and alongside him a former engineer whose identity was concealed and whose words were spoken by somebody else, Peter Frutiger, the man fired in 1977 for repairing Syria's machines. Frutiger laid the whole architecture out: rigged algorithms, foreign services, grades of security by country. Crypto AG sent its chief executive, Michael Group, onto Swiss television to answer it. Group knew the allegations were true. He denied them anyway, fluently, patiently, the way a serious man corrects a rumor, and he was believed. The denial landed like a second opinion from a better doctor. That performance is the single most effective thing anyone did to protect this operation in 48 years. And then it got worse. Or rather, it got better for Langley. On the 4th of December 1995, the Baltimore Sun published a piece called "Rigging the Game," part of a series on the NSA by Scott Shane and Tom Bowman. It reported American officials traveling to Zug in the mid-70s for secret meetings with crypto executives. Crypto AG publicly called the claims hearsay and invention. In 1996, Der Spiegel published its own version, describing the Americans as an authorized fourth party to the decryption. In 1998, an American magazine laid out the Siemens connection. Added up: a whistleblower on national television, a concealed engineer confirming him, a book, a major American newspaper investigation, a Der Spiegel piece. Over 4 years in 3 countries. Roughly 9 out of 10 customer countries kept buying. Some could not afford to believe it, because believing it meant admitting that decades of their own secrets were already gone. They looked at the reporting the way a man looks at a diagnosis he cannot pay for. Some had nowhere else to shop. Some simply preferred the machine on the desk to the thought behind it. Whatever the reason, the practical result was that the truth about Crypto AG was public, in print, for 25 years before anybody acted on it. So it is worth stating plainly what those countries were declining to believe. At its height, the operation covered somewhere in the region of 120 governments. The customer list included Iraq and Iran, while the two of them were killing each other in the marshes. Egypt, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Qatar, the Emirates. India and Pakistan, both of them at the same time. Turkey, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, 4 of those 5 in NATO. Panama, whose communications mattered a great deal to the United States in December 1989. Venezuela, Nigeria, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the military governments of half of South America. The Holy See was a customer too. What the agencies did with Vatican traffic has never been published, and anyone who tells you otherwise is inventing it. 2 governments were never customers, and their absence is the shape of the whole thing. The Soviet Union and China built their own machines and trusted nobody. So the superpower confrontation itself was never inside this operation. Everybody caught in the middle of it was, and the reading was not necessarily limited to 2 capitals. The Dutch academic Bart Jacobs has documented a European signals intelligence arrangement under the name Maximator: Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Sweden, some of whose members benefited from the same weaknesses, which is where the arithmetic in the CIA's own history comes from. A customer's most secret traffic being read by at least 2 and possibly 5 or 6 foreign countries, on a machine that customer had paid for. The customers held their nerve. It was one of the owners who lost his. The Germans had been nervous since Bühler, and by 1993 they were finished. Reunified Germany was a different country with different politics, and the calculation had shifted. The BND's people could see what a public exposure would cost. A NATO member caught reading the mail of other NATO members, using a neutral country's industry as the cover. The politicians wanted out. The intelligence veterans did not. You do not walk away from an operation that works. the politicians won. In 1993, Germany sold its half of crypto AG to the CIA for $17 million. There was an understanding that the Americans would keep sharing what they collected. That understanding fell apart quickly. Having handed over the operation, German intelligence discovered it could no longer be certain it still belonged to the small set of countries the United States does not read. Bernd Schmidbauer, the Chancellery Minister who handled intelligence under Helmut Kohl, confirmed the operation on the record to German television in 2020. He is the most senior official of any government ever to do so, and what he confirmed was not a rumor about the past, but a policy his own office had signed. There is an irony in the German half of this that is worth holding for a second. The BND got out in 1993 specifically to avoid the political damage of being caught. 27 years later it was caught anyway, not by a journalist digging and not by a defector, but because it had written the whole thing down for its own archive in 2008, and the archive leaked. One partner had decided the risk was unbearable. The other one ran the company for 25 more years. What finally killed Crypto AG was not journalism, or Iran, or Switzerland. It was mathematics becoming free. Through the 2000s, encryption stopped being a thing you bought in a box and became a thing built into software, into phones, into published standards that any graduate student in the world could attack for fun. That is the one thing a rigged algorithm cannot survive: an audience. The whole premise of Minerva depended on governments buying their secrecy as hardware from a vendor and taking the vendor's word for the contents. That market drained away like water out of a cracked tank, and by the middle of the 2010s, the CIA was running a declining Swiss manufacturer for a diminishing return. So the agency took it apart. In 2018, the company was split and sold. The Swiss domestic business went to a new firm called Psi-1 Security, taken over by former crypto managers. The international business went to Crypto International AG, bought by a Swedish businessman named Andreas Lind, who says he had no idea what he was buying. The headquarters building in Steinhausen was sold off separately. Crypto AG itself was formally liquidated on the 31st of October 2019. 48 years, and it ended as a real estate transaction. Then in January 2020, in an office in Zug, reporters put a stack of documents on Andreas Lind's desk. The documents were a roughly 96-page internal CIA history titled Minerva, a History, written around 2004, together with a companion oral history compiled by the BND in 2008. Two intelligence services had each written down, for their own institutional memory, exactly what they had done and how, and both accounts had leaked. On the 11th of February 2020, the Washington Post, the German broadcaster ZDF, and Swiss public television SRF published simultaneously. 120 governments learned, in an afternoon, that the sealed envelope had never been sealed. The Iranians learned what Bueller had been arrested for. The Argentinians learned what Vidman had been sent to tell them, and the CIA's own historians, writing for an audience they assumed would be cleared and internal, had supplied the headline themselves: the intelligence coup of the century. The one country that could not shrug was the country whose name had been the product. The Swiss reaction was fast and it was furious, and then it produced an answer nobody had wanted. On the 15th of January 2020, before publication, the Federal Council appointed a former federal judge, Niklaus Oberholzer, to look into it. On the 13th of February, Parliament's own oversight body, the Business Audit Delegation, opened an inquiry under its chairman, Alfred Heer. Its report landed on the 10th of November 2020, and here is what it said. Swiss intelligence had known since the autumn of 1993. The Strategic Intelligence Service understood that Crypto AG was controlled by foreign services and was exporting deliberately weakened equipment. The knowledge sat with a handful of people. The report names the service directors Fred Schreier, Hans Wegmuller, and Paul Zinnecker. Marcus Seiler, who ran Swiss intelligence from 2010 to 2018, was briefed orally when he took the job and took the matter no further. It was not until the spring of 2019 that his successor, Jean-Philippe Gaudin, asked for a full briefing and told the defense minister. 26 years, and no Swiss politician was ever told. Switzerland had also in that time taken the benefits. It could read certain foreign traffic. It traded intelligence with partner services. And it learned which encryption devices its own government should stay away from. Between 2011 and 2014, the intelligence service destroyed relevant correspondence files instead of archiving them. The committee's conclusions were narrower than the outrage. The operation had been legal, it found, under the law of the time and under current law. What was wrong was that the political level was never informed. It also found that suspending the successor company's export licenses had been neither materially nor legally justified, and that the criminal complaint filed against Crypto AG looked political. On the 21st of December 2020, the Swiss Attorney General dropped the case entirely. Insufficient evidence of a deliberate, unjustified breach of export control law. And what Switzerland's government actually knew before 1993 remains contested. The Federal Council denied knowledge. The report establishes knowledge inside the service. Constitutional lawyers split in public. Oliver Digelman called it a clear violation of neutrality. Laurent Goetschel argued it depended entirely on what the authorities really knew. Neither position has won. The verdict, in the end, was that nothing illegal had happened to anyone. Boris Hagelin died in 1983, wealthy, in Switzerland, having never once put the arrangement in writing. William Friedman died in 1969, a year before the purchase his handshake made possible. Heinz Wagner, who fired the engineer, later conceded only that the company was not entirely free to do what it wanted. Kjell-Ove Widmann's algorithms and his reassurances were never publicly disowned by anyone. Sigmar Grutzmann, who ran research and development and was reportedly sickened by it, died in 2016. Mengia Kaflisch and Jörg Sporndli learned in February 2020 what they had actually spent their careers building. Peter Frutiger was proved right 43 years after he was sacked for fixing Syria's machines. Bernd Schmidbauer confirmed everything and faced nothing. Andreas Linde lost his export license and cut 70 jobs, then started a new company under a different name. No officer of the CIA or the BND has ever been charged with anything, anywhere. The building in Steinhausen has other tenants now. The machines themselves sit in museum display cases across Europe, gray boxes with their wheels exposed, and in some of those cases alongside the machine, the original operating manual, written by the National Security Agency. Hans Bühler died in Zurich on the 27th of July, 2018, 19 months before the story broke, and 18 months before anyone could tell him he had been right. Nobody ever did tell him what he was arrested for.